The Strait of Hormuz is on fire, and the world's response tells you everything you need to know about who actually holds power in this new global order. Right now, as you watch this, roughly 20% of the world's oil supply has been effectively choked off by a single narrow waterway barely 21 miles wide at its tightest point. 0 ships passed through the Strait of Hormuz in a recent 24-hour period. 0. Compare that to the normal daily average of 60 ships carrying oil, fuel, and the lifeblood of modern economies to every continent on Earth. That number alone, 0, should stop you cold, because the Strait of Hormuz is not just a geography lesson. It is the jugular vein of the global economy, and right now something very sharp is pressing against it. Oil crossed $100 a barrel. The Iran war is now in its 3rd week. The United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on February 28th, and since that day, the world has not been the same. Trump stepped onto Air Force One and issued a demand to roughly 7 nations, China, France, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and others, send warships, secure the strait, or don't expect Washington to forget. That is not diplomatic language. That is a warning with a long memory behind it, and the silence from those nations is deafening. President Trump has demanded that about 7 countries send warships to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, but his appeals have brought no commitments as oil prices soar during the Iran war. And when you sit with that reality for a moment, genuinely sit with it, you begin to understand the profound strategic miscalculation that is unfolding right in front of us. Not just Iran's miscalculation, not just our allies' miscalculation, but a failure of strategic imagination that has been building for decades inside the corridors of Washington, Brussels, and Tokyo alike. Let me walk you through what is actually happening here, because what the media keeps giving you is noise. What you deserve is clarity. The president said his administration contacted various countries throughout the weekend, with some providing positive responses, and others saying they would rather not get involved. Now pause on that phrase. Rather not get involved. These are nations that are existentially dependent on Gulf oil. These are not neutral bystanders expressing a polite preference. These are nations whose economies, whose manufacturing bases, whose entire energy infrastructure runs through that narrow strip of water. And they are telling the United States of America, the country that has spent billions every year maintaining a naval presence in that region, that they would rather not get involved. That is a sentence worth reading twice. Nearly 70% of the crude oil passing through the Strait of Hormuz goes to China, India, Japan, and South Korea. 70%. And yet, here we are with American taxpayers once again being asked to carry the full weight of a global security architecture that benefits everyone except the people footing the bill. Trump's language aboard Air Force One was blunt in a way that Washington rarely allows itself to be blunt. He told reporters, "I'm demanding that these countries come in and protect their own territory, because it is their own territory," and added, "Whether we get support or not, I can say this, and I said it to them, we will remember. We will remember." 3 words, and buried inside those 3 words is probably the most consequential diplomatic statement made in years, because it signals something America has been reluctant to say openly for a very long time, that the free ride is over. Now let us be honest about what started all of this. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi told CBS that Tehran has been approached by countries seeking safe passage for their vessels, and that Israel and the U.S. started the fighting with coordinated attacks on February 28th during indirect U.S.-Iran talks on Iran's nuclear program. Whether you agree with the decision to go to war or not, and this is something serious people disagree about, the reality is that the war happened, it is ongoing, and the global consequences are accelerating faster than most analysts projected. Brent crude oil prices surged from around $70 to over $110 per barrel within days of the conflict beginning, with the disruption affecting approximately 20% of global oil supplies transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Think about what $110 oil means to you. Not to a hedge fund in New York, not to an energy conglomerate in Houston, to you. It means higher gas prices. It means higher prices at every store that ships goods by truck or airplane. It means your grocery bill goes up, your utility bill goes up, and the Federal Reserve faces choices it does not want to face. According to an IMF analysis, every 10% rise in oil prices corresponds with a 0.4% rise in inflation and a 0.15% reduction in economic growth. Run that math on a sustained $100 plus oil environment, and you begin to understand why words like recession are being whispered in finance ministries from Seoul to Frankfurt to Washington. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps declared it would not allow a single liter of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, with a spokesperson warning that any vessel linked to the United States, Israel, or their allies would be considered a legitimate target, and adding, expect oil at $200 per barrel. $200 a barrel. Now, some will dismiss that as bluster. Maybe it is. But you do not dismiss it until you have a plan for the alternative, and right now no coherent plan exists. Hundreds of tankers sit idle on both sides of the Strait of Hormuz as Iran has effectively closed the waterway, and even the IEA's emergency release of over 400 million barrels from global reserves, the largest ever, amounts to only about 20 days of typical flows through the strait. 20 days. Emergency reserves can buy time. They cannot replace geography. So what are our allies doing? The UK's Prime Minister Keir Starmer told reporters he is working with allies on a plan to reopen the strait, but said it would not be a NATO mission and that Britain would not be drawn into the wider war. Germany went further. A spokesperson for German Chancellor Friedrich Merz stated bluntly, as long as this war continues, there will be no involvement, not even in an option to keep the Strait of Hormuz open by military means, and added that the US and Israel did not consult Europe before the war, and that Washington explicitly stated at the start of the war that European assistance was neither necessary nor desired. That last sentence deserves your full attention. Washington told Europe it did not need them, and now Washington needs them. That is the position the United States finds itself in. That is the credibility gap that no aircraft carrier group can close overnight. Trump has also threatened to delay his summit with Xi Jinping if Beijing does not help secure the Strait of Hormuz, as the US-Israel war stifles oil supplies and unsettles ties between the world's biggest economies. And here is where the geopolitical chess becomes genuinely fascinating, because China is not a passive actor in this scenario. China gets an estimated 90% of its Gulf oil through the Strait of Hormuz. China has more to lose from a permanently disrupted Hormuz than almost any other nation on earth, and yet China is calculating carefully, coolly, the way China always calculates, whether the benefit of watching the United States bleed diplomatically and economically outweighs the cost of the oil disruption itself. That is a calculation only a rival power with patience and long institutional memory makes. And that tells you something about where we stand in the global power transition that so many in Washington refuse to acknowledge is already underway. Edward Fishman, a director at the Council on Foreign Relations, noted that the Trump administration did not consult allies in Europe or Asia before launching military action against Iran, allies who are far more dependent on Gulf oil imports than the United States, raising questions about whether those allies would now expect concessions from Washington in return for their assistance. That is the architecture of the crisis in one paragraph. You go to war without consulting the people who need the resulting security most, and then you demand they join the cleanup. This is not a judgment about whether the war itself was just or unjust. This is a structural problem of sequencing and alliance management that has now produced a situation where America's leverage is real, but its goodwill account is deeply overdrawn. The economic math is uncompromising. The war will cut the global supply of oil by about 8 million barrels a day in March, the International Energy Agency estimated, accounting for the near closure of the Strait of Hormuz, as well as oil industry attempts to route around the problem and production increases elsewhere. 8 million barrels a day gone from the global market. That is not a rounding error. That is a seismic supply shock. And while Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth have been predicting a short war, they have shifted what the end goal is, naming removal of the Iranian regime and security for commerce in the region, as well as nuclear concerns, as the objectives. When war aims expand mid-conflict, that is historically when timelines slip and costs multiply. Anyone who has studied American military history since Korea knows this pattern with painful familiarity. Iraq and Kuwait have already begun to shut in production, with analysts warning that the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia may also be vulnerable if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed for a sustained period. And Saudi Arabia could face production shut-ins within 2 to 3 weeks if conditions persist. This is the cascade that energy analysts have feared for years. The Strait of Hormuz does not just carry Iranian oil, it carries the output of virtually the entire Persian Gulf. When it closes, the entire Gulf energy complex begins to stall. And the Gulf is where the margin barrels live, the barrels that the world calls on when supply gets tight anywhere else. When those margin barrels disappear, the buffers disappear, and what follows is the kind of sustained price shock that reshapes economies and topples governments. Christian Buger, a professor of international relations at the University of Copenhagen and an expert in maritime security, told Al Jazeera, "For the shipping industry right now, it's impossible to go through the Strait of Hormuz. And if there are not stronger signals in the near future that they can at least try to go through the strait, then we are looking at a major shipping crisis, which can last weeks, if not months. Weeks, if not months." And insurance premiums reflect that reality. The shipping industry does not move on hope. It moves on actuarial math, and right now the math says stay out. What does Trump's demand actually represent in strategic terms? Strip away the politics, strip away the personalities, and look at the underlying logic. For decades, the United States has been the guarantor of the global commons, the sea lanes, the shipping corridors, the energy arteries of the industrial world. And for decades, the nations that benefited most from that guarantee paid the least for it in blood and treasure. The American taxpayer subsidized the economic growth of Germany's export machine, Japan's manufacturing base, South Korea's electronics industry, and China's staggering industrial expansion. All of it depended on cheap, secure, reliable energy flows through waters that American sailors patrolled. Trump is not inventing a grievance. He is articulating a grievance that has existed for 40 years and been politely suppressed because Washington believed the arrangement served American interests too. In an interview with the Financial Times, Trump said, "It's only appropriate that people who are the beneficiaries of the strait will help to make sure that nothing bad happens there," and added of NATO, "We've been very sweet," citing U.S. support for Ukraine despite it being thousands of miles away. That is not just a transactional argument. That is a structural argument about the sustainability of a security model that was built for a different era, a different economy, and a different balance of global power. The question is whether Trump's confrontational style is the right instrument for a conversation that needed to happen, because the conversation itself is legitimate even if the timing and execution are being conducted under fire. Israel has struck more than 2,000 targets across Iran and used over 10,000 different munitions throughout the course of the war, now in its third week. More than 70% of Iran's ballistic missile launchers have reportedly been taken out of service. Iran is being degraded militarily. That is the honest assessment. But military degradation and political resolution are different things entirely, and history is full of nations that continued to resist long after their military capacity suggested they should have stopped. Iran is fighting on its own territory with its own population's survival and identity at stake. That is a different kind of motivation than a nation fighting for commercial interests or ideological prestige far from home. The real question, the one Washington needs to answer before this crisis deepens further, is what victory actually looks like. No one in power is talking openly about sending troops into Iran, and the U.S. and global economies may be able to pull through the Iran war even if oil prices remain high. Maybe. But may be able to pull through is not a strategy. It is a hope. And hope is not a plan when you are managing a conflict with the potential to reshape the energy architecture of the entire planet for a generation. The 7 countries Trump addressed this week are not just being asked to send warships. They are being asked to take sides. They are being asked to accept risk. They are being asked to do publicly what Washington did without consulting them. And their silence, or their soft refusals wrapped in diplomatic language about timing and circumstances, is its own answer about where the world's loyalties actually lie when the moment of decision arrives. That answer should concern every American who believes the post-World War II order was built on something more durable than convenience.